we're diving into one of the biggest updates yet in Bryan Kohberger's case. I'm talking about defense shells that could flip this whole trial upside down, and DNA evidence under attack, eyewitness testimony falling apart, and shocking new revelations about unknown blood found at the crime scene. Is the prosecution's case about to collapse, or will justice still be served for these 4 beautiful lives that were taken too soon? Stick with me, because what you're about to hear might have you questioning everything.
Without me hearing his voice, I'm like, it's unconfirmed. But if you got friends that knew him and grew up with him saying it's confirmed, then I gotta say, hey, yeah, this is probably Bryan Kohberger.
In section 1, DNA evidence controversy. So let's break this down. The core of the prosecution's case rests on one piece of physical evidence, a tiny speck of DNA found on the button of the knife sheath left at the crime scene. That sounds solid, right? You've got DNA tying Kohberger to the scene, open and shut case, right? Wrong, because here's where it gets messy. Turns out the FBI uploaded this DNA genetic genealogy database websites like MyHeritage and Ancestry that are usually off limits to law enforcement without a warrant. And according to Kohberger's defense attorney, this is a major violation of his 4th Amendment right.
That suspect, Bryan Kohberger, was back in court today for a second time this week. The students were found stabbed to death in a home just off campus in November of 2022. Their families have now been waiting for more than 2 years for a trial to begin. After 3 days of arguments, the judge in the Kohberger case must now decide whether to allow key DNA evidence to be presented at his murder trial. The defense had argued police should have secured a search warrant before detectives analyzed DNA collected from the crime scene and before they gathered and tested items out of Kohberger's trash at his Pennsylvania home. The state does not believe collection of evidence at the crime scene or in the weeks that followed violated any of Kohberger's rights.
Particularity requirements objective is that necessary searches should be as limited as possible. A search warrant must be particular enough so that as to what is taken, nothing is left to the discretion of the officer executing the warrant.
All of these warrants were not general warrants. They were all sufficiently particular. Each one of them listed that they were specific to the type of crime, the location.
The judge says that he will be taking all of those arguments from the week into consideration before issuing his final ruling.
If the judge agrees, that means every piece of evidence that followed from the arrest to the cheek swab DNA that confirms Kohberger's match, that could be thrown out. Without that DNA, the prosecution's case takes a serious hit. And here's where it gets even more concerning, and what else could fall apart without this key evidence. Stick with me, because the lack of physical evidence is even more shocking. In section 2, lack of physical evidence.
Your Honor, we're here because the state has alleged that a single piece of evidence ties Mr. Kohberger to this case. This witness has claimed that she's not sure what she heard or saw was real, or whether it was at a dream.
We know it wasn't a dream because they found the evidence discovered the next morning.
Bryan Kohberger's quadruple murder trial is scheduled to begin this summer. But if his lawyers get their way, this trial won't start at all. Kohberger's lawyers are trying to get most, if not all, of the evidence in the case thrown out. And they've revealed a lot of new information about the night of the murders. Kohberger's lawyers spent 2 days arguing, questioning witnesses, and presenting evidence to Judge Stephen Hippler about a number of things, including investigative genetic genealogy. That's how Kohberger was identified as a suspect. Kohberger's lawyers also claimed that Moscow police officers misled a magistrate in their affidavits when applying for search warrants and when seeking the warrant for Kohberger's arrest. Kohberger is accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students, Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle at a house near campus in November of 2022. He says he's innocent. The crime was horrific, and police have said in a probable cause affidavit that Kohberger's DNA DNA was left on the snap of a K-bar knife sheath left next to Maddie Mogan's body. Kohberger's lawyers say the FBI's process violated his rights, but the prosecution disagrees. Here's a little bit of attorney Ann Taylor arguing on behalf of Bryan Kohberger.
Your Honor, our position is that the court should suppress the IgG identification and everything that flows from that. This is supported by 4th Amendment of the United States Constitution, due process, Article 1, Section 17 of the Idaho Constitution. Your Honor, there was no warrant for several phases of the search that led to the IgG work, investigative genetic genealogy. And we think every single one of those stages, a warrant was required. None was given, and so this must be suppressed.
Now, the defense maintains the investigative genetic genealogy work performed by the FBI violated Kohberger's rights because agents accessed databases of companies that may not have permitted them to do so, which violated the terms of services for those companies.
Let's say my DNA is taken lawfully. What privacy interest do I have in the search of the DNA of others?
That's a loaded question.
Why is it a loaded question? Isn't it a factual question?
It is, Judge, but you're assuming that the DNA was taken lawfully, and our position...
That part is an assumption. In my hypothetical, I said my DNA taken lawfully. Why would I have standing to object to the search of other people's DNA simply because I might share some genetic information with them because they are distantly related to me?
Well, Your Honor, our position is that this work was not done lawfully, that it was unlawful, that there needed to be a warrant, that this was done outside of a warrant. And I'm not asserting on behalf of anybody else in this, any relative, anybody who might have been named or not named.
Even assuming that that's all correct and that they violated the terms.
Seems to be the evidence.
The terms of service, Your Honor, don't affect the Fourth Amendment. The terms of service, and certainly Mr. Kohberger does not have standing to raise a violation of the terms of service. And even if he did, the remedy for the terms of service is not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. As we argued in our brief, the individuals, and as came out in testimony today, the individuals who are utilizing these databases, and we're talking about millions of them, are willingly sharing their information with each other, with millions of other people.
Isn't there a subset that says, but I don't want these people to look at it?
In some of the data,
the FBI, as I understand the evidence, then says, okay, we agree, we won't search those ones.
So I'll address that part, but on the database piece, the issue is that no one sharing this information with millions of other people could have a reasonable expectation of privacy. The test for that isn't, do they have a reasonable expectation of privacy against law enforcement? It's against the public writ large.
Judge Hippler has been presiding over this case now for several months, and he has a way of putting both the defense and the state on the spot when they make their arguments, and he did it right here.
IgG was used in this case, and yes, it did point to the defendant. But the fact that that happened doesn't mean that there was a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Unless the court has any questions, we'd ask you to deny the motion to suppress.
If FBI, in fact, violated the Fourth Amendment rights of Mr. Kohberger, you would agree the state is burdened by that?
That's a great way of putting it, Your Honor. Yes, the state would be burdened by that.
Now, let's talk about what investigators didn't find. They searched Kohberger's car, his apartment, and every inch of his belongings. Guess what they found? No blood from the victims whatsoever, no murder weapon, nothing. And here's the kicker. There's also no evidence that Kohberger even knew the victims. No texts, no DMs, no stalking history, nothing. How does someone commit a brutal knife attack that left so much blood it literally leaked from the house and yet not leave a single drop in his car or apartment? That's what the defense is going to hammer hard in court. But if you thought that was bad, wait until you hear what's happening with the eyewitness testimony. This part might completely change how you see the case. Section 3, eyewitness problems. If you've been following this case, you know there's a key witness, Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates. Early on, Dylan told police she saw a man with bushy eyebrows wearing a mask walk right past her after the murders. She said they made eye contact. She locked herself in her room. But here's where things get weird. Over several police interviews, her story started changing, and at one point she said she might have dreamed the whole thing. Then she admitted she'd been drinking heavily and wasn't sure what she saw.
Let's get to Dylan Mortensen, who is the eyewitness. He went in the middle of the night. He killed 4 roommates. There's another roommate who wasn't there, and there was this roommate, Dylan, shown here. And she is what they called an eyewitness in the affidavit. She said she saw a man of medium build with bushy eyebrows wearing like a COVID mask, that they'd made eye contact with one another. She was frozen frozen shock phase, and he went by her. She went back into her room. She locked the door. She stayed in her room until almost noon the next day as her roommates were bleeding to death. No one can understand the decision making, but no one's been in such a situation. I don't understand what happened with Dylan. No one does. Talk about your witness collapsing. She may not even be able to give the prosecution what I just said.
What happened was, what you related was happened in the first interview the police had with Dylan. Over that week and the next week that followed, there were 3 more interviews. Those 3 interviews, she seemed to change her story. She said that perhaps it was sort of a dream she was seeing. She couldn't be sure. Then she said that one of the victims had gone down the stairs and that wasn't possible because the victim had died in her bed. And then she admitted finally that she was just too drunk. That too drunk was the words that Ann Taylor used to come to any reasonable consideration of what happened that night. And then finally, on the 4th interview, just before they were going to arrest Kohberger in Pennsylvania, Idaho cops showed her a picture of Kohberger and they asked, "Can you identify him?" And she said, "No, I can't." And that really weakened her use as a witness, between being too drunk, between saying that she might have been dreaming the whole thing, and then not being able to identify the photograph. Prosecution's big witness, I don't even know if she'll testify at the trial.
I don't know if she will either. And that may have been the point of her changing her testimony. Like, picture a scenario in which she's just too terrified to sit in a courtroom across from this guy. And also in front of the public, which, I mean, she didn't have anything to do with these crimes. It's just, there's a fair amount of like, what kind of a person would go back into their room and not call 911 after, she's saying she's so afraid of this person, she went into shock. It's just hard to understand.
But not only does she not call the police for 8 hours, the first people she calls are not an ambulance, not the police. She calls fraternity people to come to the house. They come and they call the police.
And they are the ones we believe now, Howard, who found the bodies?
Yes. There's a new video that just was released last week, and you can see Ethan's twin brother, there actually were triplets, sitting outside the house the moment when the police arrived, and he's wearing a pink sweatshirt sitting by a dumpster with his head in his hands. It's a very poignant video.
Wow. So because that was always one of the big mysteries, that it was somebody else. It wasn't Dylan who called 911 when ultimately the authorities were called, and we didn't know who it was. But now we believe it was the fraternity brothers who she called to come over to the house.
Yes, the fraternity brother, the actual fraternity brother who made the call was Ethan's best friend. Police have never released that 911 call. I imagine it will be played at the trial.
That is unbelievable. So she is saying she doesn't know if she actually saw him or if it was her mind playing with her. She conceded that she had a lot to drink and was too inebriated to remember anything that happened that night with any authority. And when they showed her a photo of Kohberger after the fact, she failed to identify him as the intruder she had seen. These are terrible facts.
Not a very good witness.
No, she's not going to be helpful at all. And it's unfortunate. Their case doesn't rise or fall on her. Boy, you'd much rather have her say, "I'll never forget those bushy eyebrows. And if I see those eyes again, I'll know them." And then say, "There they are, right there at defense table."
And what's making all these doubts about the case, there's a bill that's just been introduced in the Idaho legislature. It was at the beginning of January, where right now the death penalty is administered through a chemical injection, and then if the chemicals aren't available, then there is a firing squad. Well, the Idaho legislature new bill wants to get rid of the chemical injections and just make it a firing squad.
But here's the biggest bombshell when police showed her a picture of Kohberger later on. She couldn't identify him as the man she saw. For a case that relies heavily on circumstantial evidence, having your main witness struggle to recall events is a major problem for the prosecution, and it doesn't end there. This next part, it might just be the wildest revelation yet. 2 samples of unidentified blood found at the crime scene. Section 4, the unidentified blood. Now, this part right here is mind-blowing. Investigators found 2 samples of blood from unknown males inside the house, one on a banister leading upstairs, and another inside a glove found outside the front door, and neither sample has matched to Kohberger, the victims, or anyone else known to visit the house. And here's the twist. The defense is now suggesting that Kohberger's DNA got on the knife sheath innocently before the murders ever happened. Could these unknown males be accomplices? Did someone else leave the knife sheath behind? There are the kinds of questions that could raise serious doubt in the jury's mind. And that's exactly what the defense wants. They're setting that stage for what could be the biggest fight in court, a Frank's hearing that might get this evidence thrown out entirely. Now, Section 5, closing and heated debates. At the end of the day, here's where we're at. The defense is throwing everything at this case to create doubt, and honestly, some of their arguments are landing hard, and the judge is even considering holding a Frank's hearing, which could lead to key evidence being thrown out, and if that happens, this case could change completely. But the question remains, can the prosecution hold it together and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bryan Christopher Kohberger committed these crimes? Or are we watching this case start to fall apart and crumble? Let me know in the comments what you think. And do you think the prosecution has enough to win this case, or is it slipping through their fingers? And if you're new here, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for all brand news. Much love and light to every single one of you. And remember, we do this to be.
It's, you know, that's him 100%. I mean, without me hearing his voice, I'm like, you know, it's unconfirmed, but if you got friends that knew him and grew up with him saying it's confirmed, then I gotta say, hey, yeah, this is probably Bryan Kohberger. But, you know, I did send it into the FBI. I did clip that. I also went through 80,000 phone calls, found the number, sent it into the FBI as well, and they have that, and hopefully they get down to that information.
Good. Do you know that they are in receipt of it? Did they come back to you at all?
I know they have it. I never got an email back yet.